sentiments, manners, and moral opinions. This, again I remind you, was in November 1790, well before the momentous events that followed the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of the Republic, the execution of the King and Queen, the declaration of war against much of Europe and against England as well, the confiscation of the property of dissidents and émigrés, the imprisonment, expulsion, and assassination of more moderate and not so moderate revolutionaries, and finally the establishment of the Reign of Terror. 3 years before Robespierre came to power, Burke took the measure of his man and his regime. Justifying perfidy and murder for public benefit, he wrote, public benefit will soon become the pretext, and perfidy and murder the end, until rapacity, malice, revenge, and fear more dreadful than revenge could satiate their insatiable appetites. I must tell you, by the way, that the term Reign of Terror is not a term invented by opponents of the revolution or by later historians. It was a contemporary term. It was the official term that was designated as such by the so-called Constitution of the Terror. This was the revolution Burke described, or rather predicted, in his reflections on the revolution in France. An extraordinary feat of political imagination. Burke's critics have never forgiven him for that premature, so to speak, account of the revolution, for recognizing the seeds of the terror so early and so dramatically. Nor can they forgive him for recognizing the philosophy and the temper of mind that had inspired the revolution and had made it so total a revolution. In this sense, the reflections was even more provocative than it seems on the surface, for it was an indictment not only of the French Revolution, but of the French Enlightenment as well, which was even more revolutionary, aspiring to create nothing less than an age of reason. This is why so much of the reflections went well beyond the revolution itself, reflecting upon the nature of man, society, politics, religion, and much else. Reflections that are as provocative and challenging today as they were then, and, I may add, to conservatives as well as liberals. A distinguished professor of literature, I'm told, I was told this just the other day, used to open his lecture on Hamlet by telling his students, "This play is full of quotations." So I would say, the Reflections is full of quotations as well, and so I must warn you is my paper today. Not only because no paraphrase could begin to do justice to the original, but also because these quotations make for a rather different reading of the Reflections, and therefore a different view of Burke than the familiar one. I shall also take the liberty of quoting from an earlier essay I wrote on Burke to highlight the contrast between these two views of Burke. That early Burke, the subject of my first published essay, appeared under the title Edmund Burke, the Hero as Politician. The word hero obviously meant ironically, there's nothing heroic about that Burke as I presented him. As I then described him, he was a politician lacking any substance or philosophical seriousness. The characteristic words in his vocabulary, I said, were convenience, expedience, prudence, and accommodation. For philosophers, metaphysicians as he called them derisively, he had nothing but contempt, accusing them of applying to politics, with disastrous consequences, the abstract principles of philosophy and morality. Quote, "Nothing can be conceived more hard than the heart of a thoroughbred metaphysician." This is from a letter from by Burke. It comes nearer to the cold malignity of a wicked spirit than to the frailty and passion of a man. As evidence of Burke's animus toward philosophy, I cited his praise of prejudice and superstition. I had rather remain in ignorance and superstition, he wrote in another letter, than be enlightened and purified out of the first principles of law and natural justice. And then there were those other two twin words, prescription and presumption, which he took to be the basis of all government and authority. The prescription of ancient laws and authorities, and the presumption that what exists probably should exist. Finally, there was Burke's glowing account of the beauty and innocence of Marie Antoinette and the charms of an age of chivalry, which I derided as reminiscent of the Magnolia and Old South school of rhetoric. That was my early Burke. Almost 2 decades later, after several rereadings of the Reflections with students, and perhaps too, prompted by the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, which was reminiscent to me of that revolution of sentiments, manners, and moral opinions that Burke had talked about. At that time, as I say, 2 decades later, I wrote a reprise of that early essay. The hero as politician of the first essay became, in the title of the second, The Politician as Philosopher. Each of the items in my earlier indictment was turned on its head. What had been cause for criticism became an occasion for praise, or at least for amplification that put that point of view in a quite different light. Today, on yet another reading of the Reflections, I will go further, finding in it evidence, hence all of those quotations, not to be sure of a sustained philosophical treatise, but of reflections worthy of serious philosophical consideration. Yes, Burke had a great distaste for abstract concepts and precepts, and a high regard for prudence and expediency in the practical affairs of government. Not metaphysical abstraction, he wrote, but circumstances, giving reality to every political principle, its distinguishing color and discriminating effect. This is often quoted as suggesting that Burke made of circumstances the whole of politics, the be-all and end-all of political activity and political theory. But what he clearly said, what he actually said, was that circumstances, that is, particular situations, give shape and form to political principle. There was principle, then, behind those circumstances. And more than principle, there was for Burke something like a great chain of being, an overarching contract that gives legitimacy not only to politics, but to all aspects of human life. In my earlier essays, I had casually dismissed as inconsistent with a pragmatic political Burke his much-quoted statement declaring the state to be, quote, a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. In context, that statement may seem less paradoxical. The passage opens with the assertion, society is indeed a contract. A contract, Burke went on to explain, that contains many subordinate contracts, some of which, like a partnership for the trade of coffee or tea, are occasional and can be dissolved at will. But the state, Burke insisted, cannot be so dissolved, because it is a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are dead and those who are yet to be born. And beyond that, it is a partnership with nature itself, so to speak. That great, quote, that great primeval contract of eternal society, linking the lower with the higher natures, connecting the visible and the invisible world. Every sort of moral, every sort of civil, every sort of political institution aiding the rational and natural ties that connect the human understanding and affections to the divine are necessary in order to build up that wonderful structure, man. Burke's state, one may say, like Aristotle's polis, was rooted in the very nature of man, man being a political as well as a social animal. The key words in this account, in Burke's account of this primeval contract, are linking and connecting. The lower and the higher natures, the visible and the invisible worlds, the rational and the natural, the human and the divine, the moral, the civil and the political, the past, the present and the future, all are linked together, all come together to create man. The dominant image I find here and throughout the reflections is that of a continuum, a relationship among seemingly contrary or disparate elements that somehow converge, making sense of what otherwise would be paradoxical or incongruous. It is just such a continuum, the linking of past, present, and future, that explains Burke's view of liberty. A liberty that is not an absolute right inherent in the individual, but is rather the product of time and circumstance. Just as property, he pointed out, has to be acquired and then secured, that is, preserved and perpetuated, so do liberties have to be acquired and then secured. And both are secured by the same means as an entailed inheritance. The idea of inheritance, Burke wrote, furnishes a sure principle of conservation and a sure principle of transmission, without at all excluding a principle of improvement. We secure our government and our privileges in the same manner in which we enjoy and transmit our property and our lives. By this means our liberty becomes a noble freedom. It has a pedigree and illustrious ancestors. The image of a continuum also clarifies what otherwise may seem perverse in Burke, his defense of superstition and prejudice. In my early essays I had quoted, derisively as many others have, his remark, "Superstition is the religion of feeble minds." But that bold statement was preceded by a warning that an excess of superstition is a very great evil, and it was followed by the assertion that an intermixture of superstition and religion is desirable, else he will deprive weak minds of a resource found necessary to the strongest. Now, this idea of an intermixture of superstition and religion seemed to many at the time, as it still seems to many today, demeaning to religion, and worse, demeaning to those in need of religion. Religion pour les autres, so to speak, for children or servants or others of weak mind. As if anticipating that criticism, Burke went on to say that religion is not a mere invention to keep the vulgar in obedience. On the contrary, it is a resource for the strongest as well as the weak. Indeed, religion is of the very nature of man. Man, Burke declared, is by his constitution a religious animal. To deprive man of his religion, he warned, would be to create a void that could only be filled by some uncouth, pernicious and degrading superstition, a superstition that would not complement and support religion, but would rather subvert and degrade it. Here too, Burke was being prophetic. The terror was to replace Christianity with just such a syncretistic pseudo-religion, the religion of reason, or the cult of the supreme being, as it's called.